Good morning, good evening. My name is Tammy Ho. I am a founding co-editor of CHA, an Asian literary journal, which is a Hong Kong-based international Asia-focused online publication founded in 2007, 10 years after the handover. Thank you for being here. Today is the second day of our the Writing Life Beyond COVID-19, a virtual residency co-organized by CHA and Mongrel Writers Residence. Mongrel Writers Residence is founded by Susie, and I would like to say a few words about her. Susie is a transnational Indonesian Chinese American writer who splits her time between many cities and cultures, and she's currently based in New York. She has written 14 books of fiction and nonfiction, and also edited or co-edited 4 anthologies of Hong Kong writing. Susie is currently co-director of the International MFA in Vermont and previously directed Asia's first low residency MFA program in Hong Kong. And perhaps, Susie, you can tell us a little bit more about the new residence.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you for being here. The Mongrel Writers Residence is part of the reason we're doing this week because Tammy and I were talking about trying to do an event, and I said, well, I was going to start this private writers residence in northern New York State, and of course with the COVID year, we've kind of limited doing that this year. So it probably won't happen until next year. But the idea was to make it a place for people who are not, who are transnational like myself. And especially I was interested in writers from Asia because that's my background. I come from Hong Kong and my family's from Indonesia. I just feel like, I've been lucky in that I've been able to go to some really nice writers' residences around the world. But I don't think that there's enough that's specifically for writers from Asia and writers who are perhaps don't quite fit into one culture or one language or one nationality even. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. But anyway, I want to thank Tammy and Cha for co-hosting this with us. And I'll turn it back to her and let her take it away with our 2 writers tonight, or this morning rather, in Hong Kong.
Thank you. Today we have 2 writers reading their work and also commenting on each other's writing. Our first writer is Hayley Katzen. Hayley migrated from South Africa to Australia in 1989. She worked in public law and law reform before working as a law lecturer and researcher. And she completed an MFA at the CityU of Hong Kong's low residency program. And Hayley's memoir about rural invisibility and isolation was launched recently. Our second writer today is Marco Yang. Marco is from Hong Kong, a Hong Kong-based poet, and his poems have appeared in a number of publications. He has an MFA in poetry from New York University, and he teaches creative writing in English, and he has taught at NYU and CityU in Hong Kong. So I would like to invite our writers to read their work first. But before you read, perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about your journey as a writer and also the inspiration behind the piece that you are reading. Perhaps we can begin with Marco.
Okay, sure. So basically this piece that I'm going to share with you is basically a very common experience that you have in any city setting. So you're basically on a train, a very congested train on the way home from work, and how that kind of public realm actually is related to the private, and how intimate actually there is with strangers. So that's basically the sort of like a backdrop of the poem. So yeah, I think that's a pretty good, pretty interesting like contrast to what Hayley's piece is. So like, yeah.
Can you also just say a little bit about how you have become a writer and
That was I started pretty young, but it was like I started with fiction or some essays, but then I think over the course of my undergraduate years at HKU, then I discovered that poetry is something that I want to do. So and then I spent more time with poetry, and I did an MFA at HKU before, and that was sort of like a cross genre MFA. So I did a couple like fiction, nonfiction, and then afterwards I decided that poetry is something that I wanted to do.
Good morning. My name's Hayley Katzen, and I'm going to read a piece that was commissioned by the Griffith Review for their Through the Lens series. It's titled Every Paddock Has Its Problem, Lockdown and the Big World Out There. I pause as I climb the rocky hill with a gift of warm muffins and call in the dogs before they race towards the top dam. Last June, that dam was dry. The paddocks were drought bare. The hay we fed our cattle daily didn't sate their hunger. And I was in the midst of chemotherapy. October brought bushfire, February a flood, and then with March came lockdown. I worry about the vulnerable in that big world out there, particularly my own loved ones in Spain and South Africa. But here in the winter sunshine, I smile at the green posies that sprout haphazardly from charcoal trees. Trees I thought might never recover. My jeans are wet to mid-thigh, and seed speckles the dogs as they bounce through the long grass. We have again that most precious resource, water. We who live rurally have been significantly less impacted by the fear, dangers, and significant changes COVID-19 has wrought. As my partner Jen often says, every paddock has its problem. From this rural vantage point during lockdown, I've been intrigued by the changed way people connect in the big world out there. Suddenly, I'm able to attend cultural events by Zoom. Busy city friends want to meet up, and there are countless suggestions for dealing with isolated living. For years, I've been practicing and pondering isolation. The farm where I live is miles from the scaffolding I was raised to believe life depended upon. Isolation has been my problem with this particular paddock. I've always known separation. As a child in South Africa, the apartheid government divided us into communities based on that most superficial of criteria, skin colour, while international sanctions isolated us from that big world out there. Later, as a migrant to Australia, my sense of safety and belonging still resided in my birthland, far apart from where I now lived. But it was another move 15 years ago, away from urban juiciness to Jen's relatively isolated cattle farm, that showed me the complexity and significance of connectedness. For years, I was ashamed of my dissatisfaction with this rural life. I had Virginia Woolf's material privileges, as well as the non-material privileges that a room of one's own symbolized, the power to contemplate and to think for oneself. Freedom, safety, and joy were mine, if only I could seize them. My need for connection seemed increasingly irreconcilable with the virtues required for rural living. I marked page after page of Montaigne's On Solitude, grateful that he understood how challenging it was to gain power over ourselves, to live really and truly alone, and do so in contentment. I was bewildered that fire brigade meetings, the fortnightly bar and barbecue at the Mud Brick Community Hall, emails and phone calls with friends didn't satisfy my hunger for connection. Trips to town didn't assuage the longings either. I discovered that the more time one spends alone, the more difficult it becomes to connect with others, the more weight every encounter carries. I wonder if others are discovering something similar now. I longed for regular, nuanced face-to-face interactions, the shared silent witnessing and listening, for roots out of the repetitive labyrinth of my contemplative mind. Social media was no solution. Its lack of context merely emphasized my exclusion from the big world out there. But then I discovered too how when we were flooded in, isolated for days or weeks, I felt a kind of delighted wonder. Everyone on our side of the creek was in it together. Jen was in the kitchen making pink grapefruit marmalade, and, freed of guilt about weeding or collecting manure, I was at my desk. An external force was responsible for our isolation, and I felt accompanied. The solidarity with the locals I knew only from firefighting and from funerals. Now that big world out there has been thrust into a similar kind of isolation. And again, oddly, I've felt accompanied. So too as commentary on our need for connection has burgeoned, alongside the frequent use of terms like social isolation burnout. I've felt less ashamed of my long and halting adaptation to rural life. These days I treasure the privilege of space and nature and the capacity to work, as long as our limited satellite download lasts. This is how it is too for most of my neighbours. Even Terry, who's camped in a caravan after his grand design home was destroyed in the October fires. As I said, every paddock has its problem. Constraints inevitably lead to creativity. Farm life led me to new selves and ways for living. And lockdown has seeded change too. My cousin, a ballerina in London, has been teaching Zoom bar classes, posting ouchy clips of polishing wooden floors or cleaning windows as her own legs stretch in unseemly ways. The writing community has also turned to new platforms. Writers Go Forth, Launch, Promote, Party is just one Facebook group for writers launching books during lockdown. I'm one of those writers who had events cancelled. Ironic, really, given my memoir is partly about rural invisibility and isolation. But my lockdown launch month was a delight. The virtual launch was video clips. My book balanced on a burnt stump as I spoke to my imagined audience, and then read extracts in the cattle yards or other locations in which they were set. And as we filmed these pieces, I pictured a friend too ill to leave her bed, others quarantined in tiny apartments, people confined to their houses and unable to even go walking. I launched my memoir untethered from the calm familiarity of home, a rarity for a rural writer, joined by my own special people from around Australia, Spain, London, South Africa and New York. How wondrous during such ominous times to be so accompanied, and for a book's birth to bring so many people together, despite the currently impassable borders. Now as I walk, these warm muffins wrapped in a tea towel for the crew building a sparkling fence to replace our burnt one, I thump back to reality. Borders and disconnections of some description exist. They probably always will. In Australia, we have a gaping digital divide, amongst others. And during lockdown, without postal services to Spain and South Africa, my people haven't been able to buy a hard copy of my book, or until recently get it on Kindle or iBooks. But that's a piffling problem for my paddock, in an era when a good day is, as Geraldine Brooks wrote in her novel of the plague, Year of Wonders, one when no one died upon it. Then I spot a kangaroo, alone since the bushfire's slaughter, and she meets my gaze. And I wonder, did such a good day exist pre-COVID-19? When have we known a day when no one died? From the plagues of domestic violence, poverty, climate change, racism, or hate? But as that rue bounds away towards the bush, that thought is superseded by my preoccupation with the glorious recoveries of my own body and of this landscape and community since the devastating October bushfire. If natural disasters galvanise communities, if ruptures make space for the new, perhaps lockdown's contemplative and creative awakenings can mobilise us all to new kindnesses and solidarities, to the change needed for communal and planetary health. It's our paddock. It's we who need to resolve its problem, regardless of those seemingly impassable borders. Thank you.
Read for us his poem.
Yes, sure, definitely. Before that, I think for easier reference, so I'll put up the PDF file, a copy of my poem. And
nice.
This poem actually would be picked up by, it's actually already picked up by Voice and Verse in the upcoming 2020 bilingual poetry, bilingual anthology of Hong Kong poetry.
Wonderful.
It would come out like, probably later this year. So, but then this is for your reference. So I put it on the chat so everybody can have a copy while I'm reading this. Okay, so. Okay, here it is. Train. So many eyes fixed on screens. Some trace the dots on the map, some the hands on watches. Only the romantics rove from one's gaze to another. Interlocking shoulders, casual touches, brushes of knuckles and kneecaps, and I'm shrouded in a profusion of scents, residues of a day's labor, sour deodorants, sweat's persistence, the unmistakable musk of mixed fragrances, though the notes have faded. And where's the source, if not in the wild dampness of armpits, stretched necklines, collars and ties loosed? And when the woman next to me coughs, I know her coffee order, the tuna and eggs sandwich she ate for lunch. This intimacy among passengers, the congruence of personal and communal breathing. At every stop, when the doors split open, then struggle to close, how mindful everyone is at first, less so after half an hour. In this free-for-all of impatient shows, I'm almost elsewhere. I no longer care if we are all pursuers of small romances, if it's love that moves and moves us. But I'm still here in the car, hand on the rail, amazed by how much I can learn through smell, how it misguides my instinct, and in turn, how little is made known to me. Just like the morning I last pressed my nose on a lover's spine, basking in the receding heat, what's left of desire, blind to the listlessness, all the possible lights ahead of us, and the fact that there's no getting there. Whatever we are only here now.
Thank you so much, Marco. I'm going to give that a hand also. Really appreciate it. I see Tammy has sort of come back.
Yes,
I
I'm
don't know.
so sorry.
You are. Oh, good. I'm so glad you're back.
Sorry
So
about the technical.
we've managed to record. We're recording now again.
Mhm.
So since both Marco's piece and Hayley's piece, you know, well, Hayley's is already published and Marco will be. It will be. We will advertise this on our site so that anybody who wants to can go find them and read them. Okay.
Thank you so much. Sorry for missing some of the reading. Has Hayley read your piece?
Yes, she has.
Okay. Before we started, actually, Marco and Hayley, they were commenting on each other's selection already. So perhaps we can begin with your feedback on each other's work.
Yeah, let's just talk about how I think Hayley's piece is reminds me so much of Olivia Lang's collection of essays, which is called The Lonely City. So it talks about how one can feel particularly lonely or like feel more isolated in a city because of all the, I would say, all the possibilities that is offered to you, but at the same time, all the possibilities that are denied, right? So because you can see so many people around you. So, and I'm interested in how like Hayley navigate that, because of course you have been here in Hong Kong as well, and then now you're currently living in rural Australia. So how do you navigate that? Like what, especially during this time too, well, everybody is like in knockdown.
I think that's what is so fascinating about that loneliness in the city as opposed to the loneliness in the country. And it is intriguing. We can look at Olivia Laing's book, as well as The Odd Woman in the City by Vivian Gornick. So, you know, I think we've got all sorts of kind of comparisons. For me, really, the sense of disconnection that I felt here, it felt like I'd lost connection over years. And I think that was a whole lot of personal inner transformation that needed to happen to realize that one can still be connected, and one is always connected and interconnected. So I do think it's our inner lives which informs so much of that connectivity. What I think is interesting in terms of our two pieces being, you know, juxtaposed here is how you gave me such an immediacy of smell. And I guess despite the online and the digital world and what it's offering us now during this period, that sense of being in the same space with someone is the thing that I think I've missed most. You know, when I, apart from Jen and, you know, an elderly neighbour that I would see, or the fire brigade, most days I would see no one. And I think if I was walking on the road and I had one of my through the car window conversations with a human, I loved that. You know, there are my dogs having a ball because they want to smell 200 things a day. But, you know, I wanted that face-to-face-ness that we really miss. Other than this, I mean, this is great, but we can't smell each other and we can't look at the same thing together and have a chat. So I think I'm ranging a little bit. Have I answered your question at all?
No. Yeah, no, I mean, that's, I think it's very, very, I would say apt way of like describing face-to-face encounter, because, well, I think like apart from like the visual, I think one of the first thing that you pick up on a person when it comes to an encounter is how they smell, right? Like, I mean, not in a like salacious way, but then it's the immediate like feeling of that person. So like, I think that is also like that makes this like Zoom like lacking in a way. So I totally agree with that. And yeah,
I think the other point that I found interesting with our juxtaposed pieces, if I may,
sure.
was that notion of the present moment and the now and its capacity to change. I got that so strongly from your piece, Marco. You know, that, you know, you put us there so in the present, you know, hand on the rail, all those things. And the fact that there's no getting there wherever we are, we're only here now. And oddly, you know, that's, I think, what I've learned. For years, I was searching for where my home was, where my belonging was. And, you know, the last page of my book, I say, as I hoisted manure into the wheelbarrow, I realized the real question was not where and with whom do I belong, but am I truly here in this place now? And I think those kind of inner transitions and those places that we get to and that appreciation of that impermanence is really the way that we navigate isolations of any description. And, you know, Vivian Gornick, I just opened it because, you know, this is the other benefit of Zoom is we've got our books beside us, haven't we? And I just opened to a page and she, if I may, she writes, "Our inner lives," William James announced, "are fluid, restless, mercurial, always in transition." And I guess, you know, that's, I suppose, what I think is so interesting about these two pieces together and how we navigate isolation and aloneness.
Yeah, and I think like I'm glad that you mentioned the end of my poems, like how we should be okay with that impermanence. It's actually somehow I think it's towards the end of the poem, like kind of like channeling what John Keats says about negative capability, like how you are have to be well, there's like what John Keats says is that you need to, like, in order to achieve that beauty, so you have to dwell on that uncertainty, the unknown, and the fact that you don't know anything at all in this world. But what I think or what I'm trying to do is, I think you have to be okay, like to feel okay, to be content with not knowing or not being, like, it's almost like the Buddhist kind of like meditation kind of like thinking, how you should be okay with not like having anything that is fixed or having anything that is like having any anchor, so and still be okay. So I think it's more about that too, like the impermanence, to be okay with, to be content with that. So I think it's yeah.
I think, if I may, Tammy,
Yeah,
is this
sure.
all right if we just keep chatting? Yeah.
Like,
I think you're absolutely spot on, and I think that uncertainty and impermanence is certainly what we're all grappling with. Unfortunately, I've wound up with cancer, so I'm kind of grappling with it on another level for myself, which is a very personal one. But I feel like my personal one is actually, it's in the world writ large at the moment because of what COVID-19 is doing to us all together. But what I think has been interesting for me in the process of writing this book and writing essay was I came to understand how my expectations of what I thought life was meant to be, how I had to deal with those expectations being different. I really never thought I would live in the middle of nowhere. I love the city. I love humans. I just want to chat to people all the time. So, I think I've had to learn how that expectation of the big world out there and my place in it is, unfounded. We have to be in the here and now. And along with that, the kind of fallibility of expectation is the whole notion of how things are constantly changing. And it's about trusting that sort of change and knowing it will be different soon, and just appreciating here and now.
And you mentioned about like you having cancer, and then now every one of us is experiencing COVID and in different ways. So I think it's almost like death is around the corner. And I think what I'm like really trying to do in my poem, or in all the poems, in a lot of the poems that I've been writing, is how you ward off death, right? How you like fight that off. And I always find that like Eros, like it's always a negotiation between Eros and Thanatos, like how love, or how, it doesn't matter whether it's romantic love, physical love, filial love, like, or friendship, like it's how that feeling of being in it that helps, that reminds you that you're alive, and how alive you are, in order to fight off that like that doom in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's a wonderful book that I read recently called Phosphorescence by Julia Baird, which is about finding awe and wonder amidst the darkness. And I think, that is absolutely, how present everything becomes for us in a time like this, for everyone. But the thing that I'm interested in, and I kind of also am very aware of, I think I've read it described as, guilty contentment, is what I feel at this time in our world. Because here I am, I can walk the dogs in the morning, I am, able to be outside, and I'm conscious that many of you are sitting in a very different landscapes, and I love the transnational nature of what TUE always tries to create. But I'm really aware how the freedom to, that whole notion of isolation and freedom, there's something there that I feel we can learn from each other. In a way, I felt trapped here for years, even though I try to make my forays out into the world. But, I wasn't really trapped. I was trapped by my own thinking. Whereas I'm conscious that for many of you, and particularly in Hong Kong during this time for you, the landscape is very different from what I'm navigating. So yeah, I just wondered how freedom affects that sort of isolation that this time is bringing.
Hayley,
sorry,
Hayley, in your piece, one of the moments that really moved me when you talked about your book launch of the launch of your memoir, and how you were joined by your own special people from around Australia, Spain, London, South Africa, and New York. And that echoes what you were just saying about guilty contentment. And I think here, this is almost a moment of gratitude about what we are collectively, globally experiencing. On the other hand, in Marco's poem, there are all these disembodied body parts and the closeness with each other. And there seem to be two contrasting experiences of the moment. And I would first like to ask you about that. And I also would like to talk about the train ride and also the climb up the hill in Hayley's piece as metaphorical or even allegorical of your own journeys differently as writers and your experience with life.
So going off that, let me just so let me just go off with what Tammy just asked about the train ride. I think, it's allegorical in a way, like everybody, like for example, everybody does that. So everybody's traveling somewhere, like in this instance where I understand it, everyone is dying every day. Like whenever you wake up, you're one day closer to death. So I think that's the train ride. And how do you want to, how it's more about how do you make peace with it and how do you feel okay. I mean, it's a futile like endeavor. I think there's some good days, there's some bad days, like how you feel about the imminent death, but then like it's just I think it's just part of living. And a little bit more to go off with what Hayley said about like guilty contentment. I have questions like, do we need to feel guilty about being content? Like that's my little like questions for everyone here. So everybody is experiencing very different things. So everybody is having their own difficulties. So Hayley, you may think that you're enjoying such kind of freedom, but on the same part, you are like in a way that you have your share of like sort of like misfortune, or like, I mean, at this moment, if you are content, should we feel guilty? Like, should we feel guilty about that level of contentment that we feel for ourselves? So that's what I think.
Marco, just in terms of that point, yes, I'm not feeling guilty about the contentment. To be honest, I do have my fair share of, I'm just lucky to be alive right now. I've just had surgery again for the second time and a recurrence of cancer. So I'm fully aware now of my, gratitude and lucky to be alive and lucky to be living exactly where I am after a hard won many years of I've come to comfort with this life that I live. Yeah. And I suppose one of the themes that I canvass in my book is how for years I felt I didn't fit in here because I felt that I had all sorts of privileges or things about me. I was, a Jewish, lesbian, South African, academic, intellectual living in the bush. I felt I didn't belong because of my things and who I was. And I felt shame about those privileges. And it took me a lot of years to come to terms with it, because you're right, we are all different and we all come in with whatever, package and baggage and stuff that we have to move through. And I guess writing certainly helps us navigate and make sense and meaning of all those sorts of things. But yes, in terms of guilty contentment, it was a London writer that I read expressing it. And I think you're right. I think it is just an enormous difference. But I am really interested in those differences and how this is playing out across the world. I mean, I went shopping in town yesterday. So Casino's like an hour and a bit away from us, and it's where our big supermarket is. I wore a mask because my immunity is low. I was probably one of 6 people wearing a mask as I walked around town for an hour. And I know that even when I was doing the MFA and I was spending time in Hong Kong, masks are something you know well. there. So, you know, and I'm sure that that's what your landscape looks like. And, you know, I wonder about that in terms of smell now too. So, you know, I think there are so many interesting differences between those worlds. In terms of the theme of me walking up the hill, Tammy, that was an interesting question. And I suppose this is the thing about writing, we often don't know what's embedded in it. Certainly there was no intention of mine to create any kind of allegory, but to be honest, I often write about walking up my hills or down my driveways or across rocky roads and up rocky tracks and through the bush. And, you know, the walking is absolutely one of my metaphors, and I've published quite a bit of, you know, walking essays. You know, one of them was called Lost in the Familiar, because I suppose the walking for me is always new. And that's part of the way moving through a landscape operates for me, is that even if it's incredibly familiar, there is always something new that comes. Some of that's because of my mercurial mind and contemplative self. But, you know, even as I watch the dogs sniff, there is always something new in that transition from one place to the next. So a learning and then another little adventure of the mind.
Thank you. Marco, you talked about first studying for different genres of creative writing, and now settle on poetry. And Hayley, you, my understanding is that you write mainly creative nonfiction, including writing reflections on your life. I want to know more about the kind of themes that particularly interest you. We already know a bit already from your reading, and the themes that interest you, and also how these very strange times have strengthened or have steered you to other themes or other topics that you would like to focus more on.
Yeah, I think a lot of my poems are like preoccupied with death and death, the death, and also like how to fight that and fight that fear. So recently, a friend of mine, when I talk about this to a friend of mine, and then recently he just said, like, challenged me with a very simple question. He said, it's like, are you afraid of falling asleep? And then that was like, yeah, like I was so disarmed, because like I just answered like I couldn't help it. There's no way that I can fight off like the body's need to fall asleep. So yeah, so that's sort of like an epiphany moment for me. But then anyways, I think during recent times, during the COVID, and you know, you see people, like a lot of people died because of that, and I have friends like grandparents passed because of COVID, and then I'm more I don't know, I feel a little bit more, light, to want to think more optimistically about life. And I'm more now, like, it's still about death, but then I'm more drawn to like a lot of like coming of age story, like Bill Dunn's Roman, a lot of like some movies, like one of the movies that I go back to is by Greta Gerwig, like Lady Bird, and how like the little teenage girl navigate her life. It's almost like that kind of coming of age story is sort of like that youth, like it's something that you can cherish in the times where death is all around you. Yeah. So Hayley,
I'm sorry to hear about your losses. That's tough. Yeah, I mean, gosh, I of course want to now talk to you about mortality, because obviously it's right in my face and has been quite significantly. But to answer your question, Tammy, yeah, I've actually written in a lot of different genres over the years. It was deciding to do an MFA that actually was the beginning of my writing nonfiction. I suppose I've always been interested in how we story our lives. And, you know, I did that in law. I then wrote a play which was about asylum seekers. and Australian attitudes. That was my first bit of writing. And then I moved to short story, which was trying to make sense and meaning of really my life. It was once I'd moved here, I started writing short story. And that's what I was writing about, was, you know, a range of issues and themes. Some of it was coming out stuff as a lesbian, I suppose, drawing on so many of those experiences one has in one's life. But the, gosh, where was I going to go with it? Yeah, coming to this form of the essay, which is really what I've primarily written in Tammy, the memoir, sort of surprised me. I was more comfy in the essay form, but it's quite, once I'd got to the point, and during the MFA, everyone was encouraging me to put a collection together, it was a bit hard to see how that would be published in Australia. And so I landed up moving essay into memoir, which has been fantastic, and I've learned masses. But I suppose, yeah, for me, the writing is so much about making sense and meaning. And some of that is around, has a lot been around the belonging and the sense of dualities that I have, the many dualities. And some of that is around my relationship to my homeland of South Africa. Some of it's around my relationship to urban. Yeah, and I suppose I have made some very big changes and transitions in my life. So a lot of my work is around making sense and meaning. And I write for that reason, really, for myself and for others, I guess. I have also written quite a bit around, you know, anti-gas campaigns and domestic violence and all sorts of issues which are deeply important to me. But yeah, I'd say that my main themes are, of course, home and belonging, which then relates to identity in a big way. But, you know, I've had a murder in my background, unfortunately, and I've written quite a bit about that. So I guess, you know, trauma is there too, but really I think so much of that is about how we make sense and meaning from our experiences and this life.
Hayley, you mentioned a play you wrote about asylum seekers. It's just a very short bit in your biography, but I'm very interested to know a little bit more about that play. And was it staged, and did you write it while you were in Australia?
Yeah, really. I mean, I've been in Australia since I was 22, so most of my adult life. I just finished writing a very big domestic violence report on police responses to breaches of what we call protection orders, apprehended violence orders. And I interviewed lots of regional rural women, and I fell apart after that work. The report was published, and I decided the only way to make change to the world, I was a young little activist, was to through story and on stage. And so that led me to act for a few years, and I did a lot of character work, which was fascinating work in terms of probably growing up. But I landed up writing a series, it was 6 traumatic monologues. So it's one woman on stage in conversation with someone else. So what she said had to include what was being said to her. And I had 6 different characters, including the most uncomfortable one to write was the Muslim asylum seeker in detention, but because I didn't feel I had the right voice, and it's a very complex issue in Australia, all that voice, as it is everywhere. But the others were, you know, the nurse in the detention centre, the activist, the politician. It was when we had Pauline Hanson had been around, and, you know, really bad conservatism. So I just tried to explore different attitudes to asylum seekers through the play. And to be honest, you know, it took me a number of years. I was acting during it, so it was my first bit of writing. The acting teachers had said to me, "Come on, Hayley, you could write this for the one teacher to perform and the other to direct." And so that's how the collaboration came together. And I learned a lot. And then we would collaborate and work through, which was wonderful. And then I watched that play. It was staged in Byron Bay, which is 2.5 hours away, and we staged it there. We had quite good audiences over about 6 nights, and some great feedback. But for me, sitting in that audience and watching my baby on stage was the hardest thing on earth. Every move or every sneeze made me think everyone hated it. I'm too anxious. So I decided it was better to sit in a room and write. And yeah, so that's why I after that was it for me with theatre.
Thank you, Hayley. Marco, I have a question for you as a writer.
Sure.
You studied for 2 MFAs, and
Mm-hmm.
and you also you have also been a teacher of creative writing. How were those different roles differ from each other for you? Do you take on what you have learned from your teachers and adapt your teachers' teaching into teaching Hong Kong students, for example?
Uh, yeah, sure. There being a student in an MFA program and like teaching creative writing, of course, is totally different thing. Like, and also there's also a cultural difference between like MFA program in the States and like teaching creative writing here to Hong Kong students as well. Like, there are definitely like techniques or craft wise, like technicality thing that I can adopt to teach. To teach creative writing here in Hong Kong. But then I think a lot of I think the different or difficulty is the workshop culture is super different between like what you do in the States and then what we're doing here in Hong Kong, which we don't like. I hate to say it, we don't have a very strong or workshop cultures where in the States where we are doing that program, we actually learn a lot from each other as well. Like not only from our teachers, but also from our peers, because of the way that we look at each other's poem. And one challenge that I discovered is how uncomfortable or how uncomfortable students can be when their poems or when their short stories are being critiqued by other people. So I think that is a very difficult barrier to bridge. So one thing that I tell my students is that submit whatever you can, submit whatever you have. They are already good, and the job here is to make it better. So like I think that hopefully it can serve as a baseline to like this is a first draft, and it is like as Anne Lamott said in her book Bird by Bird, it's always a shitty first draft, excuse the language, but then it's the job is to how to make it to a better second draft or even a better third draft. So I think that's the thing that I try to convey when it comes to holding a creative writing class.
Thank you. Our residency is called The Writing Life Beyond COVID-19, and we have a question about how you envision your writing life is going to look like after all this is history. For example, Marco, you're a teacher and also a writer. And Hayley, I imagine you will continue to do some activism work in addition to your writing. But how do you see yourself after COVID-19 has passed?
Hayley, do you want to start?
I think I think we probably need to think more about while COVID-19 is happening, because I think that's really looks like it's around for a while for us all. For me, I think not much will change for me. I mean, I write a lot all the time, really, and it's that will continue. I think what's changed for me through COVID-19 and what will probably serve me well as I go forward is that for years I longed so much to be published, and it felt like a book was the only way one gains admittance to the writer's table, which I think is probably mistaken, but that's how it did feel for me as a quite well published short form writer for a long time. And I think probably because the book has happened now and I've had a lovely time with readers and reviews, I feel that has changed for me. And so, you know, my reason for writing is to make sense and meaning, and hopefully that sense and meaning is of use to someone else. And I think I feel kind of feel a bit more confident to go ahead and do that now. I feel less full of self-doubt as I have been, and my book is full of quite a lot of self-doubt. So I think that's changed for me. Writing's like breathing, and I'll continue to do it. I think you know, an illness like cancer, unfortunately, does make one's world a lot smaller and one more aware of just the wonder of whatever one's world is. And I suppose that's very much my focus now. I feel an enormous change in priorities. And I think maybe that will be so for everyone, that life during COVID or after COVID might lead people to change priorities. Certainly I feel that for myself, which is COVID and cancer related. And I think too that the stimulation factor that I've longed for and missed so much, I think life after COVID will probably mean that this sort of Zoom interaction is more possible from wherever we are. I don't imagine it disappearing. I really don't, even if people go back to being busy lives. I think we have developed a different kind of awareness about aloneness. I mean, I think we've got a hell of a lot to learn in terms of how we deal with our elderly in all our countries. But yeah, I think aloneness, which many of us experience because of either being rural or aged or disabled or whatever, I think hopefully that there is some change to that. And that can only kind of juice up our writing lives in these years to come. As for publishing, I've got no idea how all that translates. I don't feel sufficiently competent to know, but certainly I've had a great time during the launch of this book with being able to publish short pieces. I've written a hell of a lot in different journals and papers. In Australia, our mainstream newspapers have almost, they've been hammered. So there's been much less of that sort of thing happening, but and fewer reviews and all of that. But I think the landscape of what's happening for writers will hopefully keep changing and finding new outlets and different ways of going.
Yeah, I'll just give a I don't know, it's weird for me to answer this question, because for a while in Hong Kong we were literally after COVID, but then currently now we're being hit by the third wave. So and we're currently being hit very hard with a lot of cases and a lot of deaths since January. So I mean, writing itself, during this time of lockdown, and currently I'm on leave as well, so it's helpful. It gives you a lot of time, a lot of inspirations and to write. And at the same time, I think it's important to maintain that community of writers, because I'm very lucky to have a very strong community of writers back in New York, and then we still we've known each other for more than 6 years now, and then we still keep in touch weekly, and then we write a poem a week and we share it, and then we do this over Zoom. And like what Hayley says, Zoom is more popular and more possible during these times. And I think that helps, and the habit of writing, and then to have somebody to hold you accountable, I think that's also very important. So that I think it's the community that helps me keep going. And so
I think you're absolutely right there, Marco, and that for me was why the MFA was absolute gold, because even just that notion of having to submit to a mentor and having someone who really, really cared about my work and who was relatively neutral and wasn't personally involved with me. I've been part of writing groups a lot over the years, but there was something about that, kind of structure of the MFA and that external input from someone who was, immensely experienced too and bringing so much. But all of those things, I think, is what that collective community we need as writers, and, amidst the isolation.
Well, thank you very much. I think this is all the time we have this evening. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Marco, and thank you, Hayley. Thank you, Susie, for
thank you
here today and make this possible. I will be posting the link to Hayley's piece on Charles' event page, and also Marco, would you like to share your poem more publicly, or wait till the voice and version?
I think I've already shared the file with everyone here in the audience, in this Zoom conference. So maybe we can wait until the anthology is out.
Okay.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Joining us. Tomorrow we have our third day of event, and it will be 8 o'clock in the evening. Please also join us if you are available then.
Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you especially to our two readers, Hayley Katzen and Marco Jan. It was really wonderful to hear you, and they're just fabulous pieces. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for coming, audience.
Yeah, thanks, audience.